planning is not just a one-time activity, but planning is an activity that keeps on going from day and night. You need to tell people very, very clearly what an organization is seeking out of that particular situation. Now, many times what happens is that we think that objective is there, okay, it will automatically translate into result, but that's not true. Managerial activity is firmly correlated. It has to connect with one versus the another function altogether. Good morning and welcome to the second session in Unit 2 in Management Principles and Practices, where we are going to speak about the planning process today. Now, it is very, very interesting for all of us to know how things get planned and how we move things further. So planning is not just a one-time activity, but planning is an activity that keeps on going from day and night. Now, let's talk about this planning process itself. It is actually ascertaining prior to what to do and how to do. So we have spoken about it very, very clearly about these two factors on what and how. It is one of the primary managerial functions. So we believe on this factor very, very clearly, where we have been talking about this ideology of planning as what to do and how to do. So when you look into the grid here, you will be able to see that planning is a managerial function which is goal-oriented, which is pervasive, continuous activity, intellectual, it is futuristic, and nevertheless, it involves in decision making. So whenever I talk about this word called as planning, it will involve something where the manager must take the opinion and then start working towards it. So it is firmly correlated. What I mean by saying here is that managerial activity is firmly correlated. It has to connect with one versus the another function altogether. Followed by, manager first has to set the goals, then he has to find out the alternate ways of planning. The steps that he has to take here is first understand with the people what is the process, how it needs to be done, how we need to take it forward. Can this step be taken or some other alternative be looked into? Because planning is not something that you would just like to do it because you are interested. Planning is something where you involve each and every employee of your team, ask them the opinion, find out the alternatives, and then start planning for the execution. So in the modern world, what happens is that in the corporate sector, we have a word for it called as brainstorming. Now, brainstorming is the first step in planning, which I would always like to say. When all the people in a team are called inside a discussion room, and when they are asked to just think aloud with every member, find out what are the best options available. So when you keep on brainstorming, you finally arrive at one viable idea which is passed on to the manager. The manager might think that yes, this can be taken as the best option which is elected by the team, and then he starts putting it into the planning process or planning action altogether. Followed by the planning process. The first thing that we are going to look into here, moment you look into the slide, the bright and a beautiful slide here, the first thing that comes to the top of your mind is that setting of objectives. This is very, very important for all of us here. Whenever we look into it, this is the primary step of the process of planning, which specifies the objectives of an organization on what an organization wants to achieve. So it's very, very important here. The planning process begins with the setting of objective. What is that you want to achieve out of a given situation, given ideology altogether? So whenever I say this as a planning process, as a planning ideology, a methodology altogether, this is more about understanding the process of how things are going to come in, how we are going to look into it and take it forward. Now, for example, most of us in this world will always think about this. The planning is something which is done only at the top level. So we don't have to set any objective. We don't have to think anything about it. We will just execute the plan. But that is not true. Planning starts at the root level. So what we need to do is that first, as a manager, as a leader, as an employee, you have to set the objectives. You need to tell people very, very clearly what an organization is seeking out of that particular situation. So the planning process begins with a set of objectives in mind. It starts thinking, it starts putting you forward, where you start understanding how we can take forward, how we can move forward in terms of making this activity even more interesting. Followed by objectives are actually the end results which the management wants to achieve by its operations. Now, when you look into a company, the company would have set an objective for the reason of achieving something quite humongous in terms of its operation. Now, every objective has to translate into a meaningful result. That's why we always look into this objective factor. Now, many times what happens is that we think that objective is there, okay, it will automatically translate into result, but that's not true. Why? Because to achieve that objective, every step has to be calculated, every risk has to be calculated, the parameters involved with it, the results that are going to be outcomes, the factors that are going to come out of it has to be judged properly, and then only we can set the objective. So now the objectives also need to be specific and measurable in terms of unit. This word, please understand that whenever I say the word specific and measurable, unless and until you're going to give the organization quantifiable results, they are not going to accept it. We can probably speak about theory in line and length. We can talk about this ideology of management for days together, for months together, but that is not what the organization expects from you. So when you set an objective, the objective should be specific. Now, when I say that I want to improve the sales of the organization by 30% next year, that's a specific target which I'm putting against the organization. I'm telling very clearly that the sales has to increase by 30% given the previous year's figures. So that's how I always say that the organization must understand the specificity of the target, the understandability, how it moves, how it has to be taken. And from there, we need to start building the entire system. Now, moving further, we also need to understand here about the factors that we are going to talk is the framework that each and every department has to set, has to sink in terms of the objectivities, in terms of setting up the goals for the organization. Now, let me just share an example with you here. An example is a mobile phone company sets the objective to sell 2 lakh units next year, which is double the current sales. So as I gave you the example before, when I spoke about 30% increase in sales. Similarly, here you see a figure, they say 2 lakh more units over the previous years. What does this mean? They have a target in their mind. They have a factor in the mind that this has to be achieved. So that's why an organization always emphasizes about the factor called as planning. It says very, very clearly that I want certain things to be achieved within a period, within a time frame altogether. If you are able to achieve that time frame, nothing like that. Why? Because that is what the organization is expecting altogether. So every department must understand before setting up an objective, is that objective smart enough? Which means to say that, is it time bound? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? All those factors have to be calculated. Then only the manager of the team should come forward and say that, yes, this target can be done. This target can be taken into position. So that's why I always say that this kind of planning process requires a great amount of thinking. Now, moving further, developing the planning premises. Now, this is also very, very important. Why? Because it is essentially focusing on the future, and then there are certain events which are expected to affect the policy formation. Now, when you read through this, planning is focused on future. No doubt about it. We are not planning for today. We are planning for tomorrow. So when you're planning for tomorrow, there are definitely certain events which are going to come and disturb the policy. Like all of us know that this kind of uncertainty is bound to be a part of the management. But then you need to accommodate those uncertainties, continue your planning so that you are able to achieve your objectives. Now, such events are external in nature. They affect the planning adversely if ignored. Now, nobody thought in this world that one fine morning Russia and Ukraine will land up in a war-like scenario. But yes, Russia invaded Ukraine and today the war has started and that is affecting the global economy. But that doesn't mean that the other economies will just stand still there and keep watching. They would try to plan in such a manner that with the given resources, how I need to run my economy, how I need to protect my country, how I need to protect my citizens. So that's where I say that externally, events can affect the organization. Externally, events can literally disturb the policy of the organization. They can disturb the objectives. They can disturb the results. But that doesn't mean that the organization will stop planning. They need to plan in such a manner that taking all the uncertainties into factor, they should be able to deliver the results. So that's why I say that you need to have an understanding and a fair assessment for an effective planning. You need to understand the scenario. Your internal factors and external factors have to be calculated, and then you need to take suitable measurements accordingly. Now, there are factors, assumptions on basis of which the plans are drawn, and they are known as the planning premises. So based on certain assumptions. Now, when I use this word assumption, I say those are pre-calculated, pre-thought process in terms of taking up certain steps. These are all calculated steps. They are not something just taken on gut or intuition. They are calculated steps that are being taken in terms of arriving at some objective. Now, for example, a mobile phone company has set an objective of 2 lakh as the unit sale that we thought based on the forecast, but then it is done on the basis of a favorable government policy towards digitization of transaction. In the last slide, when we were talking about this example, we just spoke about an objective of increasing the sales by 2 lakhs. But now in the current example, we are talking about that 2 lakhs sale happening. Why? Because the government policy is in favor of it. The government is promoting digital transaction. So there is definitely a chance, definitely a possibility more sales of mobiles will happen within the country. So what I'm trying to say here is that the planning premises depends on several factors which has to act favorably towards it, and then you will be able to achieve your objective. Followed by, now, identifying the alternate course of action. So what is the alternate course of action? Now, for every object, every machine that is being created by man, there's always something called as emergency exit, or there is always something called as quit that entire scenario. So always in planning also, we have an emergency exit option. We have a step where we need to find out, suppose the plan that we have decided has not worked, what is the next course of action? So the next step is to act upon them. There might be ways of acting and achieving the objectives. All the alternate course of action should be identified. So that's where I will always say that Plan A, Plan B, C, D, E, probably you use all the alphabets in English. You need to have so many alternatives well set in the place so that at that point of emergency, at that juncture, you should not keep looking out for options. At that point, you should not get panicked, you should not get confused, or you should not be thrown back by the factor that what I need to do. So I always say that whenever situation arises, please take charge, which means keep the alternatives in place so that you know exactly where we are heading to. So the alternative course of action is mandatory when we are talking about the planning process. Now, for example, here it is told the mobile company has many alternatives like reducing price, increasing advertising, after-sale services, promotion. Now, what am I giving this mobile company is an option. I'm giving alternatives. I'm telling the ways by which you can increase your sales. It can be through advertisement, it can be through after-sales service, it can be through some activity, some promotion, or some sort of CSR work altogether. But what we are trying to do is that we are trying to identify the alternative patterns through which you will be able to reach your target or your objective. So that's where I would always like to say that any course of action that is being planned inside an organization should definitely have an alternative in mind so that we see success. Moving forward, evaluating the course of action. Now comes the process of evaluation, which is very, very important. Why? Because we are going to look into the positive and negative aspect of each alternative. Now, whatever work we do in our life has got two sides. One, the pros, the other one is the cons. So which we want to see what are the positives and what are the negatives. So similarly, in planning also, there is always a positive and negative factor for every course of action that is being taken. Now, you cannot avoid it or you cannot just leave it like that. So what we need to do is that whenever an objective is picked, you need to find out the alternative course of action that is being taken by you to solve or to achieve that objective. What are all the positive and negative factors involved in that? If you find that there are too many positive factors, that means the objective, the action that is being taken by you is quite good. If you find that it has got a lot of negative factors inbuilt, then that means you need to reject that alternative. Why? Because that might cause a damage to the entire organization. So that's why I always say you need to think decisively in terms of making this particular action work for you. Now, for example, we start working out this alternative with lower risk and higher risk, or lower risk, higher return, higher risk, higher returns. All those factors have to be calculated before you take a course of action. Many times what companies do is that they first try to find out what is the factors, what are all the parameters that we are talking about in terms of growth, in terms of evaluation pattern altogether. Because this evaluation pattern is something that will matter a lot. That will actually try to bring in terms of your working parameters. So I always say that whenever we talk about the availability of capital, whenever we talk about raising of funds, whenever we talk about a new venture, it is good to plan, but at the same time, you need to evaluate what are all the positive and negative factors that are involved, that are inbuilt with that course of action, so that you are able to get the best decision taken over. Followed by the mobile phone company example will evaluate all the alternatives, check its pros and cons. So definitely the mobile phone company will try to evaluate the situation and then tell to the people, then to management, whether this action can be taken or it can be avoided. Followed by selecting one of the best alternative. Now, since you have gone through the entire process, you have gone through the entire system, you have sat with your team, you have understood, you have evaluated, now you're ready and you have picked up the option, saying that option A is better than option B. That means what you need to do, which means you will now start looking which is the most profitable one, which has got the minimum negative effect, and you will start taking that option into action. Now, please understand, option to action. That's where I use this word, selecting the one best alternative. So you have selected one and you want to take that selection into the action zone altogether, which is very, very important here. So what we do here is that we look into the manager's experience, his judgment capacity. How is he able to take that alternative? What are all the factors that that he has calculated in his mind before exercising that option? Has he thought in his mind that yes, he will do it? Has he understood that this will happen? Has he taken into account that yes, he will do it? With all those factors into position, then comes selecting the alternative. So whenever I say mobile phone company selects more TV advertisement, it will go into the online marketing with its after-sales service and target. So now the mobile phone company has made a choice. If you look into the example, the company has made a choice by saying that, yes, we will take up this option. We will go through the online marketing. We will promote more of after-sales services. We will target the customers in a particular manner, and then we will be able to achieve the target. So this is where you've selected the option and you're ready to go with that option, followed by implementation of the plan, which is very, very essential here. Now, this is a step where other managerial functions come into picture. Now, till now, we were talking only about planning, but as of right now, we are also going to talk about this, where we are going to talk the important aspect, doing what is required. Now, that is a very, very important thing. Why? In this step, managers communicate with the plan to the employees, clearly help to convert the plans into action. So that is very, very important for all of us. Why am I repeating this word again? Doing what is required. Till now, we have identified what is required, but now you have to do it. Now you have to come back and tell to the world that, yes, I have taken this option, so I'm going to put this option into action. So that's where I say, doing what is required. The manager now has to turn into an action-based leader. The option that he has selected has to come into action. He has to make his employees and the organization believe that the step that he has taken is the right step, and once it is being implemented, that is going to deliver results in the coming years. So that's where I say that implementing the plan will involve a lot of coordination, thinking, help from all corners as far as possible, which will make this step even more effective. Followed by, the step also involves allocating resources, organizing for the labor, purchase of machinery. Now, you want to put things into action. You want to see that the things are happening before your eyes, which means you will require land, labor, capital into action. So you will see that every single person, every single resource of the organization is coming forward. They are working it out, and you are able to deliver the best. So that's where I would always say that now you have come into the end cycle of the planning process. Now look at the example here. The same mobile company will now start hiring salesmen at a large scale. They create the TV advertisement. They start doing the online marketing activity. They start up setting up the service workshop. Now the mobile company has understood enough of speaking. Let's put things into action. Let's see that each and every person is ready in terms of taking up the activity. Let's see that people are believing what we have told. So we want the salesmen to come into picture. We want the sales to happen. We also want this shop to be set up so that the service starts working up. People are coming and they see that the product is working. So we are at the end of the planning process and we are at the beginning of the action. Moving further, the follow-up action, that's very, very important. Once you have done a particular action, once you have committed yourself to the customers, to the organization, saying that, yes, we are going to do it, then we need to monitor the plan constantly, taking regular feedback from the customer. You need to understand how the customer is trying to look at the product. Is it implemented across all areas? All the feedbacks of the consumer, has it been taken into account? Has it been implemented? Because many a times what happens is, theoretically we are all right. So we have all put the plans. We have all done it. But then practically speaking, has it been implemented? Are we following it up with what we have said? Are we doing what we have promised to the customer? So you need to monitor it day in and day out. Quality is not something that can be achieved overnight. Quality has to become a habit of the organization. Quality has to be imbibed into every single employee, which means you need to make regular checks, you need to make regular comparisons, set standards, make sure that the objectives are achieved by the organization. So you need to take the entire process very seriously. followed by a proper feedback mechanism was developed by the mobile phone company as an example, so that now what happens, actual customers have now started giving up their feedback saying that this is what is good about the product and this is bad about the product. So whenever you see Amazon or Flipkart, you see the star ratings coming for a product, that's exactly a live feedback where the product is monitored and being given a feedback in terms of the performance of the product. So all these things are a mandatory feature of the planning process. With this, I come to the end of this session. I hope and believe that all the important resources and the inputs that are being delivered here will be of a great help and for a benefit to you. In the upcoming classes, we will be talking more about the planning in terms of decision-making stages. What are all the factors that are involved in a good decision-making process? But until then, I want you to stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.